Oh, everybody's getting all quiet. It's the iPhone doesn't. It just turned to 1 o'clock. All right, we can start. First of all, welcome to everyone. Welcome back to the New School. Welcome to the New School if you weren't here yesterday. We're excited about the second day of our symposium celebrating the 50th anniversary of the publication of Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique. Yesterday was an incredibly packed afternoon and evening, and we will be continuing today with several different kinds of panels and then a wrap-up panel at the end of the day. So stay for one, stay for all. I want to start by introducing this panel and the panelists. And I want to sort of weave it into yesterday's events. In her keynote speech yesterday, Susan Ware argued for the importance of books and of reading. She placed Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique in the context of a long feminist movement that has been driven by both activism and acts of reading. Specifically, Susan suggested that if the Feminine Mystique should be seen as one of several books that changed the national conversation forever, she mentioned Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, Michael Harrington's The Other America, Jane Jacobs' The Life and Death of the Great American Cities, and Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed, Betty Friedan's 1963 blockbuster might also be understood as an early contribution to what would become known as self-help literature. This, of course, creates a lovely, if slightly ironic, connection to the work of one of our speakers, executive editor of the feministing blog, Samhita Mukhopadhyay, right here. Samhita's 2011 book, Outdated: Why Dating is Ruining Your Love Life, not only takes on the contemporary messages of a popular literature that purports to set young women on the road to heterosexual happiness, but also calls out to Friedan in the title to the introduction. The title is The New Problem That Has No Name. Like historian Nancy Hewitt, Samhita sees the intellectual connections between generations of feminists and raises the question of whether we ought to be talking about feminism in terms of waves at all. Following Samhita's lead, we will all go beyond the book, everyone in this panel. By this, I mean going beyond the Feminine Mystique, but also exploring the ways in which reading expands to embrace other cultural forms and phenomena that require feminist analysis, like dating, for example. Each panelist speaks to the world of ideas and actions for which Betty Friedan became symbolic back in 1963. The activist worlds that we honor go beyond the book, but nonetheless involve acts of reading, interpretation, and creative public engagement. These worlds are print journalism, art, scholarship, music, and the internet. We are generationally different, but we all overlap several of these categories of work. Nona Willis Aronowitz's work has a foot in two generational camps. Co-author of Girldrive, Criss-Crossing America, Redefining Feminism, she has also reflected on her mother, Ellen Willis's path-breaking work in what was the overwhelmingly male world of rock and roll. Jane Gerhard, to my left, an independent scholar and author of the forthcoming book, The Dinner Party, Judy, Chicago, and the Power of Popular Feminism, is, to paraphrase Jerry Rafferty of Steelers Wheels, stuck in the middle generationally with me. A final note, Susan Brownmiller, to my right, also the author of In Our Time, Memoir of a Revolution, and of Femininity, which takes up the question of what would actually become, the femininity takes up the questions that Betty Friedan actually raises in many ways about the pressure on women to be a particular thing. Susan got me thinking last night at dinner about something else when she asked me what I had thought of feminist Catherine MacKinnon when I first met her as an undergraduate in 1976. My first response was that Catherine McKinnon was gorgeous, brilliant, and compelling. I mean, that actually seemed obvious. Who could enter her presence and not want to study feminist theory? But as I began to think about it, I had a second response that took me back to Susan Ware's emphasis on this act of reading. McKinnon's collection, Towards a Feminist Theory of the State, not only opened my eyes to radical feminism, but it opened my eyes to applied Marxism and to class analysis. Similarly, Kate Millett's Sexual Politics allowed me, a prospective English major, to understand why literary criticism might actually matter. Susan Brownmiller's Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape, put history to work in an analysis of sexual violence, an issue that seemed to have become more urgent to my friends and I as we were beginning to enter elite male institutions that were uncomfortable about receiving us. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex became an introduction to existentialism and French universalism as well. Ellen Willis's essays on rock and roll opened my eyes to pop culture as a realm for serious critique that prefigured the emergence of what we now call cultural studies. And by 1981, Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party had enmeshed me in spirited arguments about art at the now defunct lesbian bar, The Duchess. In other words, popular feminism was not only about feminism. It has been an enduring invitation to women to become intellectual players in the arts and social sciences, often in fields like visual art, the law, rock and roll, philosophy, journalism, history, and the internet, where women have had to fight their way in and hold their ground. So without further ado, this panel invites the audience to engage with us. Each panelist will have 5 to 7 minutes to put her ideas on the table, followed by a facilitated conversation. By 2:45 at the latest, we will invite the audience to join us, and we will wrap things up at about 20 after 1 to give the audience a short break before our next panel. So, Susan, would you like to begin?
I'd love to. I'm someone who is very dependent on the written word, and I was very lucky to be there in that great first flush of feminism starting in the late 60s and going through the 70s, our decade, which enabled me to actually earn a living from the written word with my book Against Our Will. I decided I would like to talk about first contacts because for Dan's book, this is the paperback I read in 1964. Don't expect glue to last on paperback books. I treasure my old paperback books, but that's not what they had in mind when they created them. I was no suburban housewife in the summer of 1964 when I read The Feminine Mystique in paperback. But this book spoke directly to me. And yes, it did change my life, as many things in the following fervent years were to change my life. I want to tweak the anthropologist's definition of first contact and apply it to the moment when I'll bet each of us, everyone in this room, maybe first encountered the righteous anger of a woman and saw for the first time that ambition and anger were normal in a female person who yearned for a meaningful life and who had been thwarted by men at every turn. As she said, the problem that in those days had no name. In 1964, I was a researcher at Newsweek in a dead-end job. The men were the writers, the women were the researchers, or the fact-checkers, as we really were, for the most part. On my own time, I was a civil rights activist and had been a civil rights activist since February 1960 in the first round of student sit-ins in the South. I was one of 1,000 northern whites who went to Mississippi in 1964 for what we now call Freedom Summer. During this time in my life as a civil rights activist, I was completely unaware of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, or John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor's The Subjection of Women. I was vaguely aware of Beauvoir's The Second Sex, but, you know, I wish I had that paperback, but I never bought it. The picture on the paperback cover in 1963, for whenever, was a photograph of a naked woman coiled, shot from the rear end. And I didn't like that image, and I didn't buy the book. I didn't buy the book. At that time. I got around to it later. The title of Friedan's book put me off too, because I misunderstood it first and thought, oh, the Feminine Mystique, this lady is going to tell us all about how we should look at our inner femininity that is soft and tender and caring. That's what I thought. I did not understand at first that the title was ironic. And I think it should have been called The Problem That Has No Name. Anyway, I was vacationing at a shared summer house on Fire Island before going back to Mississippi after the summer of 1964, but I went back. I was committing myself to full-time involvement in the civil rights movement when I finally read The Feminine Mystique in paper. I think it was in the house, and I picked it up, or maybe I bought it. I really don't remember. You know, that book really did not take off in hardcover. Norton, Friedan's publisher, was famous, and still is famous, for not spending much on a publicity budget. And Friedan realized that, and she told me years later that she hired her own publicist. Now, that's very unusual. That's very unusual. It was very unusual then. Maybe it's less unusual now. Or maybe it's more necessary now. I don't know. And she got on every radio show she could get on, and that was her strategy. The other smart thing she did, and I don't want to call it a deliberate strategy, but she and a few other women got together to create NOW, the national organization. Is it of women or for?
For women.
For women, thank you. It was initially envisioned as a lobbying group of influential women. As a matter of fact, when I found out about it, you mentioned Jane Jacobs. Betty had sent a personal invitation to Jane Jacobs to join her new group NOW. And somehow she had misaddressed the envelope, and it came to my big apartment building. And I saw it downstairs, you know, at the desk where you give things back to the postman, you know, and have him take it away or something. I said, you know, I know this person it's addressed to, but she doesn't live here. I could put it in another envelope and send it to her. And he said, okay, you can do that. So I did. I mean, Jane Jacobs lived just a few blocks down the street on Hudson Street, and I was on Jane Street. So put it in an envelope, and I said, you got it, you know, right? You got an invitation from Betty Friedan. Let me know what this is. And she actually sent it back to me and said, yeah, she's forming some women's organization. I'm not interested in it. Maybe you would be. Jane was pretty, you know, involved with her housing issues and fighting Robert Moses at the time. Yeah. So I wrote a letter to Friedan and explained the circuitous route by which I had gotten this invitation to join NOW. And maybe she'd really want me because I had been I was still such an activist in civil rights. And I'm so sorry I never kept the letter. Who thought about archives at the time? She wrote back, I'm terribly sorry, but now is intended to be a small group of 100 influential women who will lobby Congress.
Wow.
Yeah. Should I have kept that in my archive?
Yeah.
Who thought of archives? But anyway, within months, I think, the pressure on Friedan and the other organizers of now made them see that they did need a membership organization, and a membership organization with chapters wherever they could have them, and that is how now developed. And I will also add that I never joined now, because after that introduction to it, I always felt it was too bourgeois for me. It wasn't in many cities, and also in New York, it collected people who were certainly not bourgeois, but that's another story altogether. I want to talk about other first contacts, because Claire also mentioned some of the first contacts. Among the SNCC women based in Atlanta in the mid-'60s, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, we all know this, people like Casey Hayden hadn't even noticed Friedan's book. They read Beauvoir, and unlike your path, they read Sartre and Camus first, and then found Beauvoir. Yeah, right. But it was their first contact with these ideas. And Casey and her friend, Mary King, then distributed something they called a sort of memo about the caste system within SNCC. The sort of memo was read aloud at an SDS conference. Marilyn Webb was there, at Students for Democratic Society, yeah. And that short piece became the Radical SDS Women's First Contact. Kate Millett's Sexual Politics and Shuli Firestone's The Dialectic of Sex were first contacts for many women in the 1970s. And although I hate to acknowledge it, Germaine Greer's Female Eunuch was a confused first contact for many people. I'm going to throw this in because it's an odd fact, and you won't know it, but it's absolutely true. Marilyn French's The Women's Room, in translation into Norwegian, became the first contact for the entire country of Norway. It was the first feminist book that had been translated.
Wow.
And if Marilyn were here, she would tell you that and more. Of course, I have to mention Gloria Steinem, whose indefatigable speaking tours across the country for decades was, and still, you know, she still talks, was a first contact for many people. I have to wind up now, I know. I just want to say that I hope we all feel very proud that the United States, our country, was the major exporter of feminism around the globe, starting in the late 60s and in the 1970s. And I do hope you realize that another first contact that I haven't mentioned, the real locus at the beginning were the small consciousness-raising groups that sprang up around the country. The intimate setting for new ideas and feelings and issues that had never been articulated before in a political context were brought to light and claimed and developed as political issues. I'm talking about abortion, rape, sexual identity, sexual harassment. It was a great time, that decade, where everything was new and exciting, and all women had something interesting and original to say and to contribute. And I'm sorry, Jane, but I have to say that I think that time can never be recaptured because for later generations, most of the ideas became received information, endlessly parsed, endlessly refined, endlessly footnoted by academics.
You bet.
But lacking the absolute joy of initial discovery.
Thank you. So which of our speakers feels that they are a natural transition from first contact? Any of you?
I think I do.
Okay.
Sure. We can just go in order, right?
Yeah, okay. Jane?
All right, we'll go kind of strange chronologically. Like many of us here today, I encountered feminism through books, which seems to be our theme for the moment. Books that I found on my mother's shelves, or that arrived, like Marilyn French's novel, The Woman's Room, via the Book of the Month Club. Just sort of like on the automatic, if you don't check it off, it's going to come. And that book was my click moment. I read it in Ohio in 1977 when I was 16. So as a reader and as a person who found a kind of sisterhood, if you will, through books rather than activism, I tend to think of feminism less in terms of generation and more in terms of libraries. All this has left me preferring to see additions to the project of feminism, including generations, as resources that we can draw on, rather than as an accounting of what me or anyone else believes. Maybe you do this too. First wave Crystal Eastman has a lot to say about household dramas that I sometimes turn to, as does Audre Lorde have things to say about the value of self-care. Very rarely my vagina will utter a word or even an entire monologue, and I feel I must call Eve Ensler. I just don't know what I'm going to need on any given day, so I check in with the living and the dead feminists who inspire me. And that's really my main sort of orientation towards the history of feminism. My own sense of homelessness among feminist labels has very much informed the approach I took in my new book on the dinner party, Judy Chicago's iconic and controversial homage to women's history, on display at the Brooklyn Museum. In that work, Chicago and the team of self-trained historians at her studio gathered a history of outstanding women. They studied their lives, their achievements, their resiliency, what the studio workers understood as the culture of women that sustained these great women. Some of the great women, 39 to be exact, Chicago commemorated with a luscious, oversized vulva plate. 999 had their names traced in gold paint on the floor tiles under the dinner party tables. The dinner party was itself a kind of mashup of European and American women, jumbled up together in a giant bingo ball spinner and plucked out to be assembled in Chicago's portrait of women's history. Betty Friedan did not get a seat at the dinner party, but Judy Chicago and Betty Friedan have some very interesting parallels. One parallel is the impact of their writing. I found that nearly all the women who suspended their daily lives to help make the dinner party, or who took 2 years out of their life to organize a showing of the dinner party when no local or regional museum would agree to show it, nearly all these women encountered feminism through Chicago's first memoir, Through the Flower, My Struggle as a Woman Artist, published in 1975. Books like The Feminine Mystique and Through the Flower might have been read privately, but they brought many readers into new awarenesses of their quite public membership in a group, the group Woman, which many of them might not have connected to politics or might even have rejected as a badge of inferiority. In this way, books like The Feminine Mystique and Through the Flower produced and continue to produce text-based identifications that supersede generation. Through the Flower still works on students in 2010 as much as it did in 1975. Like The Feminine Mystique, the dinner party both supersedes its generational location and is tragically flawed by the blind spots of its historical moment. Chicago envisioned a grand dinner party of women's history in 1974 at the high watermark of West Coast feminist art activism. She retreated into her studio with a committed group of workers for the next 5 years, and when she came out in 1979, feminism had changed. When the piece toured in the 1980s, many feminists disliked it for its lack of multiculturalism and its essentialism. And these are serious charges. The dinner party represents no woman from the global south, or China, or India, or the Middle East. We could see these flaws literally embedded in the dinner party. And we could see that the flaws make it a relic of a 70s feminism which fervently believed that woman, as a category, could stand apart from race, sexuality, and nation. And I don't know if any of you saw the documentary yesterday evening. Think of T. Grace Atkinson here. Think of that kind of clarity of her radicalism, where I'm not walking down the street with men because men are the enemy. You know, that sort of clarity is really, the dinner party has elements of that sort of insistence, you know, sort of hot-headed radical feminism. Yet the dinner party also suspended or managed to squirm out of these debates about essentialism and multiculturalism. The debates did not constrain audiences as they encountered the feminism represented on the dinner party or through the dinner party. As with Betty Friedan and the Feminine Mystique, an important and necessary gap exists between Judy Chicago, the activist, and the dinner party. And that gap enabled viewers to make the dinner party their own by adding an ingredient of personal relevancy. For some, viewing the art became their feminist awakening. It did so in a lot of ways that we could talk about, but one of the ways it did it was through the literal space of the gallery that created temporary feminist communities that anyone could enter for the price of a ticket. Once there, the dinner party didactically insisted that viewers see like a feminist, even if only for the amount of time it took to tour around the installation. As a viewer, you were interpolated, you were grabbed. There was an ideal reading offered to you that you could reject or embrace. You saw, maybe for the first time, the history of Western Civ as one of great women and the sinister counterforce of patriarchy that tried to battle them. It was dramatic. There were goddesses, Amazons, warrior queens, women running abbeys, discovering stars, getting torn apart limb by limb, dying in childbirth. You might hate it. You might cry in joy or cry in fury. You might have heated discussions with your BFF or your girlfriend or your boyfriend, but the dinner party made you think about what counted as equality and what made you think about who is in this category, woman. All this is to say that the cultural consumption of feminism is an important part of our histories. The great explosion of women's activism that we call feminism helped make the goal of women's equality into a social value. And it was able to do so exactly because feminism reached beyond the converted or the activist. The radical proposal of women's equality, something as deceptively simple as that, touched many lives in countless and unrecorded ways, many of which remain hard to trace and outside any conventional label or archive.
Great. So I'm the opposite of having prepared something. I have to have bullet points or else I get totally thrown off if I try to read something.
Fair enough.
Me too.
Yeah, that's the excuse I'll use at least. So I'm Samhita. Again, I'm the executive editor of Feministing, and very, very excited to be here. Thank you again for inviting me to this panel. And it's really kind of exciting and interesting to hear about the different roles that the Feminine Mystique played in different people's lives, since that was not my entry point to feminism at all. By the time I had gotten to kind of college and was in gender studies classes, the Feminine Mystique wasn't even part of main curriculum. At that point, it had kind of been taken out because of the criticisms around inclusion and identity and, the kind of gender binary construct that was one of the biggest criticisms, I think, of the radical feminism of the 80s. and specifically also women of color and kind of third world feminists that genuinely didn't relate to the discontents of the 1960s housewife. So it wasn't a book that my mom read. It just wasn't something that was my entry point to feminism. It was something I read much later as kind of like, oh, cool, like this, you know, like learning about it as kind of a history textbook, but still getting something out of it at that point. So kind of coming to feminism from rather than what is considered the Western feminist starting point of the feminine mystique, but coming to it instead as an intervention, right, of kind of women of color's voices that had historically been left out and had organized and produced different kinds of material in the early 80s, late 70s, like Audre Lorde. I would say my entrance to feminism really was Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider. That was the book through which I kind of found my voice and found my language of how to talk about this problem that has no name, which was living in the intersection of multiple identities, like being the child of immigrants, being a woman of color, being working class, like so many different things that didn't have a name, right? So, you know, I had kind of come to writing and come to feministing through activism, more so than, you know, I had originally wanted to be an academic feminist, but more so than coming through it from academic or from a personal experience and I was discontent in my home situation or anything like that. It was really through my activism in the late 90s that I had come to feminism and recognized the power and the importance of written text in mobilizing people. And really building on, I like the way that you framed this idea of feminism as a library, as a series of texts. And one of the most poignant moments for me for Occupy Wall Street was when they took the library down, right? And everyone was like, how can you take the library down? That's what we stand for. And really realizing early on in my activism that while it was so important that I was doing this work, the way that I was talking about it and the way that it was framed had so much to do with what we could actually do and what we could actually push forward. And so really building on that, in the, I guess it's the mid-outs, in 2004, Jessica Valenti and her sister Vanessa Valenti, the founders of Feministing, noticed a gap in, at that moment, there was a lot of kind of political bloggers and people writing about political issues, but there wasn't really a space online for women to talk about feminism. If you were an alien and you read the mainstream media, you would believe that feminism was dead. There was not a single feminist in our generation. We were obsessed with Britney Spears and all wanted to be her. And you know, the last known feminist was Madonna. So we were kind of culturally in a gap, right? And that's not to say that feminists didn't exist. In a lot of ways, activism wasn't being covered by the mainstream media, and a lot of it had gone into academia. So you had a very strong kind of burgeoning gender studies departments all over the country, but you didn't have a translation of that really important academic work into the mainstream, into a way that was accessible for a broader kind of base of people that would be interested but may not identify with the loaded term feminist. So kind of out of that empty space, Feministing was founded, and we learned very quickly, actually, feminism was quite alive and quite vibrant. Most young people just hadn't had a space to kind of express themselves. They hadn't had a space to come together. They didn't believe that, in a lot of ways, they didn't believe we needed it anymore, because some of the more tangible things that are, you know, the feminists from the 60s and 70s that they had fought for had already been accomplished. So we were like, well, obviously we can do anything. We can go to college, we can get a promotion, you know, we can sue our boss if we don't get that promotion and we think it's sexism. In most parts of the country, we can access abortion. In a lot of them, we can't, unfortunately. So, you know, in a lot of ways, young women believed that they didn't need feminism anymore. It, you know, it wasn't the same kind of black and white policy, legislative struggles that it was before. We all know from reading the news that's not actually true. This was a very, very effective kind of PR campaign to bring feminism down and say, actually, you don't need it anymore. Just work hard and you'll get there. You know, it's just a coincidence that you also happen to have all this pressure to be awesome in college and be really good at your job and be really hot while you're doing it. That's just a coincidence. That's not actual pressure. So it was really exciting to see so many young people become engaged and really starting to radicalize their sense of self and how they were kind of navigating this new terrain of gender and identity, and really not limited to just feminism, right, or to kind of gender, but a feminism that recognized all the different issues and identities that fall into this broader category of kind of feminism. So as we kind of continued, we realized that a lot of the fractures that, so many of us that were born out of this radical moment in the early 80s and the 90s of being like, oh, the feminists of the 60s and 70s, yeah, that was great, but like they didn't, capture this and they didn't capture that. A lot of those divisions had actually reproduced themselves in kind of contemporary ideas of feminism. And it was kind of this aha moment. Oops, I guess it's not that easy actually to talk to everybody and act like you know what you're talking about. Like inevitably you're gonna leave people out. Inevitably every single one of us, or as I believe Donna Haraway calls it, has a standpoint epistemology, right? Everybody has a place that they're looking from and blind spots as a result of that. And so it's been this tremendous learning experience for us, and this constant moving and evolving identity of what feminism is, and going back and forth, wondering, do we even need the word anymore? Do we even need, to kind of organize in that centralized way anymore? And I think a lot of the activism is telling us sometimes yes and sometimes no. And for as much as I've heard many kind of my older sisters say feminism is dead in our generation, that genuinely does break my heart, because there are so many young people doing such a variety of different kinds of work, not just around identity, but around changing the quality of their lives or the quality of their communities, and whether that be through immigration reform, or around, a really good example, I think, is the National Domestic Workers Alliance and iGenPoo and the work they're doing around women, undocumented women that are deported and separated from their families. That may not be called feminist, right? But that is very much feminist work. Or some of the work around masculinity and the kind of invisibility, the new problem that has no name, of men's roles and how men can kind of get involved in issues around violence against women and sexual assault, and really kind of important issues that we don't necessarily even have the language to talk about or are not diagnosed as problems. And then, around evolving from reproductive rights to this frame of reproductive justice, or really pushing against what we think of as feminist activism. And so I think that in a lot of ways that work is really happening and it's really exciting. But all of that said, I do think Friedan's initial frame of, and I really like what, Susan, what you said about how the book should have been called The Problem That Has No Name, because I find from that book that's the one concept that I keep coming back to. And it's not necessarily about whether I can agree with or identify with the specific issues that she was getting at, or the specific experience that she was kind of trying to elaborate on, but how insidious so many of the ways that we internalize ideas about gender and ideas about race and ideas about class that impact the way that we kind of navigate the world and what we think is possible for ourselves, which ultimately is the root of oppression in so many ways. So I just want to read 2 paragraphs that I wrote this week about Friedan, and then I'll pass it over to you, about whether the feminine mystique would make sense today. Considering the changes to the economy, the suburban housewife and her discontents is hardly what is on people's minds. Instead, worry about keeping mortgages and paying for college are issues that have taken center stage for American families. While culture has shifted, economic disparity has intensified, the site of a lot of gender-based oppression. Also, the ultimate model of the housewife is no longer a white woman, but is instead First Lady Michelle Obama. This is to say, things have changed a lot since the 50s and 60s. From a cultural standpoint, the question, how far have we come, forces upon itself a linear model of progression that assumes there was a starting point and a shared goal, that at some moment, a collective we would know we were equal. But that cultural moment was never set, it never came, and it was obviously fractured by our varying histories. And clearly, we're still searching. We're still searching for the right answers and solutions to gender-based oppression. For as much as I can't relate to the feminine mystique and Friedan's specific case for women's rights, I can relate to this. As long as we continue to believe in any way the inequality we experience in our lives is natural, innate, and unquestionable, we're still not there yet. But if we start to ask the right questions, we just might be moving in the right directions.
Hi, Hi, everybody. I'm Nona Willis Aronowitz. It's been a little while since Claire's introduction, so I thought I'd say that again. I am the daughter of Ellen Willis, a noted feminist and also rock critic, which is part of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm kind of taking the phrase beyond the book literally in my particular set of remarks because I've talked to hundreds of young women. I've talked to and interviewed many, many women of older generations. And a lot of what they call their first contact, as Susan said, their entry point is pop culture. My friend Emma and I went on a road trip in 2007, which was the basis for our book, Girldrive, and we talked to hundreds of young women about their lives and ambitions and what's important to them and whether any of that relates to feminism. And invariably, we heard a lot about pop culture. We heard about the women's pop culture site Jezebel a lot as their first entry to feminism. We heard about, Riot Girl. We heard about the Guerrilla Girls, which I see are present in the audience. We heard about art and music and Beyonce and Britney. And it wasn't only, finding feminist role models in pop culture, but being able to see sexism and misogyny clearly through that lens. I think sometimes, what Samhita was saying, it's the kind of sexism that young women come up against is not legislative. It's sort of much more insidious because ostensibly we already have those rights. Yet sometimes in pop culture, it's enormously obvious when sexism occurs. People are tearing somebody down for being fat. People are seeing pictures of Rihanna being beat up by Chris Brown and blaming her. Some of these things play out in a very dramatic fashion in pop culture. And at the same time, we're always just ruminating on whether so-and-so is a feminist. Is Beyonce a feminist? Is Tina Fey a feminist? Is Sarah Palin a feminist? There was this hilarious post on the website Thought Catalog, which was literally sort of a poem of feminists and sort of making fun of feminists, just endless links of those kind of pieces, those thought pieces of whether so-and-so is a feminist. And in one sense, it is kind of navel-gazing and funny when people do that. But in the other sense, it's really indicative of how important pop culture and sort of our entertainment and our leisure time, how it really shapes our political consciousnness. Young women and older women too are doing great work, surrounding Chloe Angel from Feministing is writing a book about romantic comedy. Every single feminist pores over TV shows like Mad Men and Girls to sort of, as a springboard into American culture and its inherent misogyny and how people react to those shows. But it really wasn't always like that. I mean, in the age of Betty Friedan, for instance, mainstream feminists were sort of encouraged not to talk about pop culture, not to talk about sex, and sort of stick with the legislative battles, that it was kind of dangerous and frivolous to consider those things. And we have to talk about the serious issues. We have to talk about, rape, and we have to talk about abortion, and we have to talk about pay discrimination. And those things are obviously all important. Those are things that my mother, coming up in the late 60s, starting Red Stockings and doing a lot of feminist activism, those are things that she cared about as well. But her day job was being a rock critic for The New Yorker. She was the first rock critic for the magazine. She started in 1968 and did it all the way until 1974. And up until recently, when I put out an anthology of her writing, I think a lot of people sort of saw those two bodies of work as very separate. Here was this weird period where Ellen Willis wrote about rock, and then here's all the rest of her stuff where she wrote about feminism and politics and terrorism and all this other stuff. But if you actually read the collection, you'll realize that that's not true at all, that a lot of what she was doing was sort of evaluating this counterculture, which was very male-dominated, as Claire said, but sort of some of the impulses being expressed, she transposed onto her own politics. She actually didn't focus on on women in rock or women in music as much as you might think. She was obsessed with Janis Joplin and really held her up as sort of an expression of this very complicated woman who was reaching for liberation and reaching for transcendence, but still wore all of her insecurities on her sleeve. And she really saw herself in Janis because she was so complicated. But she really didn't go for some of the more touchy-feely hippie music that may have been more straightforwardly feminist. There's a great piece in the book about her experience in sort of a Lilith Fair-like women's festival. That's like the closest I can compare it to. And it really didn't speak to her because it didn't express sort of the anger and the energy of the counterculture that she was involved in the East Village in 1969. She did extrapolate a lot of power, sort of personal and political power from otherwise misogynist artists while still calling them out on their misogyny. She talked a lot about Bob Dylan's misogyny. She talked a lot about Rolling Stone's sort of blatant fuck you misogyny. And she sort of made a distinction between this sort of general anger and anti-establishment feeling and then sort of actual sexism. I wish I had brought this. I brought another quote, but I just realized I should have brought this too, that she sort of sets up a test of how you can figure out whether a piece of work is truly misogynist, which is if you could switch the genders, if you could switch all the she's to the he's, and it made sense, then it wasn't necessarily sexist. She used the example of Rolling Stone's "Under My Thumb," which initially seems like an incredibly misogynist song. This guy is basically saying, I own you and I'm gonna walk all over you. But then she realizes that Nancy Sinatra's "These Boots Are Made for Walking" is pretty much the exact same thing, except with the gender switched. Whereas Cat Stevens' "Wild World," which initially seems like this tender ballad, this sort of breakup ballad, it's really incredibly condescending. It's about this guy who thinks that this person that he dated was actually this little naive girl that could never understand the ways of the world, and hopefully you'll be okay because you're a vulnerable female. I think what still happens with young women and with generations before that have grasped pop culture as a way to both see misogyny and both see feminism is that it's often incredibly messy and complicated. The reason why all these thought pieces get published, is Tina Fey a feminist, is Hillary Clinton a feminist, whatever, is because there's so many different dynamics that get thrown into one person. And furthermore, there's so much stuff going on in misogynist art that isn't necessarily, that doesn't necessarily have to stay misogynist once a feminist consumes it. One of my favorite pieces in the anthology, which is called Out of the Vinyl Deeps, if you guys ever want to check it out, plug for it, is called Beginning to See the Light, where my mom finally reconciles her love for the Sex Pistols. And I think it's really indicative why, in this one quote, why pop culture is so important, not only to produce feminist role models, but also for people to sort of negotiate their own boundaries and sort of priorities in gender and feminism. Listening to the Sex Pistols, trying to figure out if Bodies was really an anti-abortion song, I discovered that it was something even worse. It was an outburst of loathing for human physicality, a loathing projected onto women because they are babies and they have babies and have abortions and are a fucking bloody mess, quote unquote, but finally recoiling against the singer himself. Quote, I'm not an animal, he bellowed in useless protest, his own animal sounds giving him the lie. It was an outrageous song, yet I could not simply dismiss it with outrage. The extremity of its disgust forced me to admit that I was no stranger to such feelings, though unlike Johnny Rotten, I recognized the disgust, not the body, was the enemy. And there lay the paradox. Music that boldly and aggressively laid out what the singer wanted, loved, hated, as good rock and roll did, challenged me to do the same. And so when the content was anti-woman, anti-sexual, and in a sense anti-human, the form still encouraged my struggle for liberation. that was in 1977. And I think a great way to wrap this up, to sort of see the connections between the generations, because I personally feel a very strong connection to second wave feminism and third wave feminism and all the waves in between. I thought it was amazing that a few months ago, Judy Berman and Nina Polari, two young feminist cultural critics, decided to springboard off of this idea and create a zine which they expect to make into an anthology called It's Complicated. And you might know that as a Facebook status, but in their case, the subhead was Feminists Write About the Misogynist Art We Love. And I was lucky enough to be able to write a piece about Eminem, which I think sort of stands in some ways for all of hip hop. I think the rock and roll of our generation is hip hop, and it can be incredibly misogynist, and it can be incredibly off-putting. And sometimes I feel, when I was growing up, I felt as if the best songs, the funniest songs, the most entertaining songs were also kind of ignoring me and calling me like a big booty skank and not really caring whether or not I liked the song. And what I said in my piece was that unlike some people, or unlike some artists that I liked despite their misogyny, I actually paid attention to and got galvanized by Eminem because of his misogyny, because he wasn't ignoring me and dismissing me. He was screaming in my face, and he was getting me to confront the kind of misogyny that much of the country was embracing. And I eventually figured out that, you know, the fact that he was this #1 rapper had to do with partly this sort of bald-faced misogyny that our culture was comfortable with. And I just thought that this project and the essay that I wrote was sort of very consciously linking our generation to my mother's work, which at the time was pretty groundbreaking. And I see pop culture, both art and music and movies and TV, to be an incredibly important part of feminism, and will continue to be.
Thank you, Nona.